Thank you so much, Heather and Kieran. Many of you over the past more than 10 years got to know what was our former financial secretary, Judy Mabe. Of course, Judy was not just our financial secretary, but a part of our Gate City family. And Judy passed away after a battle with cancer back in May. And so I got the pleasure of knowing Judy from October of 2010 until her passing. And I thought so much of Judy, and it's still hard to believe, honestly, that she's not here anymore. But I love Judy. Judy was good to me. I had a great relationship with Judy. And of all the things that were true of Judy, this one is one that stands out. Judy was a horrible cook. Horrible cook. And I think she enjoyed looking at recipes, and she would thumb through a cookbook and figure out what could be her next victim. And so she would find a recipe, in fact, a recipe that may, under normal circumstances, be and look good. And then Judy would have this thought, what could I do to change it? And so Judy would almost randomly change out ingredients. And sometimes it would be because I don't have any of this, and that way I won't have to go to the store if I just put, I don't know, vinegar instead of sugar in it. And so I'll do something to substitute. So she operated with this premise that you can randomly change out ingredients, and somehow that'll make it better. Also, she operated under this notion, and it's false. Somehow cooking things in the microwave makes things better. Oh, cake in the oven? Oh, cake in the microwave oven is even better. And so, so many times Judy would bring in some of her experiments in to share with us, and that woman, she was generous though too, and so she didn't want only herself to be poisoned, but she wanted the rest of us to go down with the ship. And so there were more than a few times though that I would taste something in the workroom and then walk to the bathroom and spit it out. But I love Judy, and I appreciated what she was trying to do. And all of this, she was working under the pretense, well, these changes are making this better. They're making this better. But we all knew Judy is a terrible cook. Anyway, a few years into this experience, in early mid-November, we're starting to think about Christmas, and in a staff meeting, we're talking about, well, because we typically go out for lunch somewhere for Christmas, and so we said, all right, where would be someplace good to go for staff Christmas lunch? And the only person that said anything was Judy, and she listed a restaurant that none of us had ever been to. And so she says, let's go to this place, and no one else. None of us had ever been there, and Judy's talking about how it's just wonderful. It's wonderful. We ought to go there. In my mind, I'm thinking, someone, please, someone, anyone, suggest anything, anywhere. McDonald's, Golden Corral, the drive-through cookout. I don't care where it is. Please, someone suggest something else, because Judy's going to have us go to this restaurant, and Judy doesn't know what is good. But no one said anything. And so that became it. As soon as that meeting was over, I walked into Nancy's office, and we both kind of shook our heads, and we knew we were doomed. We were doomed. We're going to have our last Christmas party. And so we go to that restaurant for lunch that day, and it was amazing. Their food was killer good, delicious. It was wonderful. Everybody had a wonderful, wonderful meal. And everyone was saying to Judy, thank you so much for suggesting this. Man, this place was off the hook. This place was so blessed good. This was a wonderful, wonderful experience. You know, when I think about Judy, and I think about more than 10 years worth of memories with her, it's that, perhaps more than anything else, that stands out. I don't know why, but that particular memory comes to mind almost at the top. And the reason, in part, is her recommendation, it wound up weighing more because it came from such an unlikely source. I mean, it was from such somebody that doesn't know what tastes good hit a home run by telling us a wonderful restaurant to be able to go to. And because it came from such an unlikely source, that's one of the first memories that comes to mind when I think about my years of experience and relationship with Judy. Sometimes it is that a message coming from an unlikely source leads us to pay more attention to it. Hold that thought for just a moment, and let me just set the parameters of how we're going to operate over the next few weeks, and that is we're going to be in the book of Psalms in a series that I'm calling Anthem. Of course, you know the word anthem is another word for song, and we're going to be looking at a number of the songs of David in what is effectively the hymn book of the Bible, the book of Psalms. And today I want you to think about how God used David in sharing a song to communicate the answer to this question. How do I know that God is great? How do I know that God is great? And how David answers that leads us to pay attention to some unlikely sources. And by virtue of the unlikelihood of those sources, I believe it leads those things to weigh even more in communicating the greatness of God. Look with me in your Bibles today to Psalm 19. Psalm 19. We're going to look at the first 11 verses. There we're told in verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse proclaims the work of His hands. Day after day they pour out speech, night after night they communicate knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words. Their voice is not heard. Their message has not gone out to the whole earth. Their message has gone out to the whole earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens He has pitched a tent for the sun. It is like a bridegroom coming from his home. It rejoices like an athlete running a course. It rises from one end of the heavens and circles to the other end. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The instruction of the Lord is perfect, renewing one's life. The testimony of the Lord is trustworthy, making the inexperienced wise. The precepts of the Lord are right, making the heart glad. The command of the Lord is radiant, making the eyes light up. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are reliable and altogether righteous. They are more desirable than gold, than the abundance of pure gold, sweeter than honey, dripping from a honeycomb. In addition, your servant is warned by them, and in keeping them there is an abundant reward. God used David in the writing of this song to answer the question, how do I know that God is great? And it's not because it was something that I said over and over as a kid as part of a prayer before the blessing. God is great, God is good, let us thank Him for our food. How do I know that He is good? What David is used by the Lord to communicate is this. One of the ways that I know that God is good is because of this. Space tells me that God is great. Space tells me that God is great. Now you get a hint about the fact that this is a song because of the superscript above it, where you see it says the witness of creation in Scripture. It says, for the choir director, a psalm of David. And so this gives you an indication that this was, for early believers, something that they would sing. What kind of tune this would have been sung to, I have no idea, but it suggests this was part of their worship routine, was that this would have been effectively in their hymn book. They would sing these lyrics. And he begins by saying, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse proclaims the work of His hands. Now pay attention to those two words, heavens and expanse. What are those words talking about? Well, in short, they're talking about what we know as space, or what we call space, and all the stuff that's in space. I don't know if you've ever given a whole lot of thought to what we call as space and who it was that first gave it that title. So, what do you think we'd call all that big old space? How about we call that space? Somehow, someway, it got the title space. And that's what this is talking about. And not a specific thing, but the totality of what comprises what we know as space. And he says that the heavens, so he's talking about that which exceeds our ability to experience in day-to-day life, that which we're able to see, the heavens, this expanse, it proclaims the work of His hands. Now that's kind of strange. It's an anthropomorphism to say that space proclaims. It's an inanimate object that is able to speak. And he says that space says something. It communicates a message, and it proclaims the work of his hands. Beyond that, he says in verse 2, day after day, what's doing this? Space is pouring out speech. I mean, that which is not actually saying things with words, day after day and night after night, is communicating information, communicating knowledge. Now, according to verse 3, there aren't actual words. There is no speech. There are no words. The voice is not heard. Yet, in verse 4, the message has gone out to the whole earth, and their words to the ends of the world. So David is saying, when you look up and notice everything that you can and can't see that we call space, he's saying that the expanse of that, all of that, communicates a message every single day, in fact, every single night, 24/7 to everybody that's on the earth, that God is great. Well, how does it do that? Well, he says in the second half of verse 4, in the heavens he's pitched a tent for the sun. Now, what is a tent? A tent is temporary dwelling. And so the notion is that where the sun is, at least from our experience, it doesn't stay in place. You know that the sun, what does it do? It comes up in the east and sets in the west. So it's like it starts over here, finishes over here, and it's like an athlete that's running its course. And you're aware of this. Every single day, where is the sun going to come up from? It's going to come up from the east. Where is it going to set? In the west. Where? Everywhere. How do I know that? Because it just happens every single day, day in and day out. Beyond that, it goes from one side to the other, and every part of the earth is able to be exposed both to its light and to its heat. And so he's communicating that all of this order and precision that exists, that we're able to observe, not just in the day, but even in the night. You could look on your phone right now and say, what's the moon going to look like tonight? And it's going to tell us whether it's full, waxing, or waning, and what stage in the cycle it is. Why? Because it is so predictable, it is so orderly. And I don't know the extent to which you give much consideration to it, but God is using David to think meaningfully about this, that all this stuff that is beyond the experience that we have on earth, that we're able to look out and observe, it is so ordered and so precise, but beyond that, it is so big. It is so enormous. The scale is so colossal that it says something to us about the greatness of God, because it is the height of lunacy. It is the height of self-deception to suggest that all of that precise order is the fruit of random chance and chaos. That everything that you see, even looking up at the heavens, that doesn't audibly utter a word, that there's no sentences, there's no songs, there's no written messages, they are screaming to us about that which has made them and about the greatness of the one that has ordered all of this. David says that there is a message that space communicates. And the message, you see it, is in verse 1. What's the message? They declare the glory of God. Over and over again, I have given you my best definition of the glory of God. And very simply, again, it is this: that which communicates that God is greater than anyone and anything. So you plug that back into this passage. David is in this song. Part of the lyrics, he's saying, part of the reason that I know God is great is because of space. Space and everything that's in it, the order of it, the scope of it, the scale of it, communicates to me that God is greater than anyone and anything. It's not just the sun during the daytime that communicates the message, but even at night, not simply with the orderly precision of the phases of the moon, but even with the stars themselves. For example, you can go tonight and you can find the Big Dipper. You can find the Little Dipper because it's going to be in a very predictable place. Where it is, it has been. Where it is, it will be. Why? Because of the order, because of the precision of all of this. But how does that tell us? How does the sun coming up every day, the stars shining at night, the cycles of the moon that are so predictable, how does it tell us about the greatness of God? For one thing, it communicates the greatness of God because of the enormity of its scale. Because of the enormity of its scale. Now, tonight, if it's clear, you're going to be able to go out and you can look at some stars. All right? The nearest star to us is in a little constellation known as Alpha Centauri. The nearest star, so that's the very closest one to Earth, is 4.2 light years away. So that's not too bad, 4.2 light years. Until you consider this. How fast is light? Light is traveling at 186,000 miles a second. So in one Mississippi, light travels 186,000 miles. It's 671 billion miles an hour. That's faster than Calvin Wilson drives. Just barely. 671 billion miles an hour. So get this. If you were to leave right now and could travel 671 billion miles an hour, if you could travel 186,000 miles every second for the next 4.3 years, 24/7, then you could arrive at the nearest star. That's the closest one. Well, what about stuff just in our solar system? Like, we go, my very eager mother just served us 9 pizzas, pickles, whatever, however you learn it. So we got Pluto at one end of the solar system. Just from us, even in our own solar system, the distance between Earth and Pluto, it's 6/10,000th of a light year away. So if you could travel at the speed of light, it wouldn't take you very long to get there. But how far is that? 3.2 billion miles. David didn't have concept of some of these details. I mean, to communicate to him about the speed of light and the precise orbits of planets, the predictability of constellations. He didn't know all those details that a 10th grader could learn in a high school science class. But even in the absence of that knowledge, we are able to understand, good night, this is so big. It is so colossal, and it is so orderly, and it is so precise, it could not have come by chance. Therefore, the one that maintains all of this, the one that has made this, is greater than anyone and anything. Why is that? In part because scale communicates or produces scale. Scale produces scale. What do I mean by that? A few years ago, we had gotten some new trash cans to go down at the ball field, down at the picnic shelters. Just some gray lidded trash cans that had wheels on them so we could bring them up to the dumpster. And nothing like special or anything, but nice, decent trash cans. And we had not had them very long, and I was down at the ball field for something, and I was ticked because I looked at a couple of those lids, and they had holes in them about this size. And as I looked at them, my first thought was someone has melted holes in the lids of these trash cans. In fact, what it looked like initially is that maybe someone had taken a cigarette and was just putting it out, and that melted holes into this. And I was like, what? That ticks me off that somebody would be doing this, ruining our new trash cans. Got these holes now in the lids. Until I started looking more closely. Like, those aren't burn marks. Those are teeth marks. Well, as I looked at those little teeth marks, I did not come to this conclusion. I did not walk back up to the church and say, Nancy, we have polar bears getting into our trash cans. Nancy, we have gigantic grizzlies that are tearing their way into our trash cans. I said, Nancy, I think it's either squirrels or raccoons that have been gnawing their way into our trash can. Why? Because little teeth produce little bite marks. Why? Because scale is in keeping with scale. Stick that back into what David is saying here. It is so big. it is so enormous. It is so beyond me. It is so other than me. The scale of what I am just a little microscopic part of. And it is so orderly and so precise, the only thing that can tell me is that the one that made this is greater than anyone and everything. And so space that can't say anything, space that doesn't produce audible words, David says, is screaming a message, and space is telling me that God is great. But then he continues by describing another unlikely source, and that's this. He says that the rules of God tell me that He's good. The rules of God tell me that He's good. And so he starts by describing in a general sense. I get this very general message that just looking up and observing the scope, the scale, the expanse of all that I know is space and how big it is, how orderly it is, how precise it is, how all these things are working and functioning together, that says something about the greatness of God. And that's something that any and everyone is capable of knowing. That's general revelation. But then he describes that God has given more specific, special revelation in His law. In verse 7, he says, the instruction of the Lord. He references that, and he says that it's perfect, which means that it's got all the pieces. It's got everything that I need. And he says that it renews a person's life, that the law of God, the testimony of the Lord, it's trustworthy. And then he says, the law of God is so amazing that it takes the inexperienced and causes them to be wise. Well, how does that work? You know, a lot of times we think, when you just imagine in your mind, just conceive or picture someone wise in your mind, it's likely that you'll pick someone who's older, because so many times we associate wisdom with coming from years of life experience. On the flip side, we think about being young and dumb, right? We think about being old and wise. Wise because you've had a lot of years. Wise because you've had a lot of experience. Wise because you've been through the school of hard knocks, and through trial and error you have learned all of these lessons that now you know what potholes to stay away from and where to steer away from. And he says, listen, that's how God's laws work. That you can take someone who doesn't have significant life experience, even a young person who is paying attention to the laws of God, and it produces wisdom as if they had been living many, many years, that they are not getting stuck in pits and pitfalls and stumbling and experience colossal loss. Why? Because they're paying attention to the laws of God. Now, most of the time when we hear the word laws or we hear about the word rules, and our eyes just kind of glaze over and like, oh, rules, laws. And we typically think about them in terms of the restrictive nature of them. You can't do this, you can't do that. So there's all these thou shalt nots. But I really believe that it is helpful for us, it's helpful for me, it's helpful for all of us when we see this phrase here talking about the instruction of the laws or the precepts of God, to maybe insert instead of that the guardrails that God has put up. Because in many ways, isn't that what God's laws are? They're guardrails that He's put up where He said, if you operate in between these, you'll spare yourself a whole lot of misery and woe. If you will, instead of lying, if you will tell the truth, that you'll have trustworthy relationships where when you say something, people actually believe you. When you say, I'm going to be there tomorrow at 8, people know that they can depend on you. That it is prudent not to take those things that don't belong to you, because if everybody did that, the chaos, the anarchy that we would be operating in. And these are part of the guardrails that God has put up for us to operate within. And He says that is for our good. And He says in verse 8, the precepts, these guardrails that God has put up, He says they're right. And He says they make the heart glad. What does that mean? Well, it means that it produces happiness. Isn't that strange? Rules produce happiness. He says in verse 9 that these ordinances, these laws, they're reliable. They're altogether righteous. So I can depend on them. So it's not just rules that He erected for people back in David's day, but even today, by paying attention to them, that those are ways that I can experience happiness in life. And I can avoid pitfalls and all sorts of calamity and all sorts of heartache and trouble and misery and woe. In fact, these rules are so good, they are so beneficial, he says they're more desirable than gold. And beyond that, what they do is this. You see it in verse 11. he says, in addition, through them, he says, your servant is warned by them. These guardrails that God has put up let me know where the dangers are so that I can avoid them. We don't go out to eat very much because it typically involves taking an advance on an equity line, but it's been quite some time since I've been to a Mexican restaurant. But I don't have anything against Mexican restaurants. I like going there. But it's been a while. But it seems like every Mexican restaurant I've ever been to. So you look at the menu, you place your order, and then the server comes out with your food. And almost without exception, as they set it in front of you, they tell you what? Hot plate. I don't know what they're doing with that plate, but it is as hot as the flames of hell itself. I believe maybe they're cooking on that plate. I don't know, but it comes out and it is 1,000,000 degrees. And so as the server puts that out on your plate, they're using some sort of mitt, some sort of something to protect their hands, and they'll put it in place. If you want it moved, they'll adjust it for you, but they're warning you that it's a hot plate. Why are they saying that to you? Because if you go to adjust it, you'll lose your fingerprints, right? So they are telling you, they're warning you so that you don't experience harm. That says, at least in the most basic way, that they're thinking something about my well-being. Now put that back into what David is saying. So he starts by talking about space and how enormous space is, how orderly it is, how precise it is. And that tells me that God is greater than anyone and anything. That it surpasses my ability to get my arms around just how big He is, just how great He is, but that this God who is so great, who upholds all of this, who creates all this and maintains all of this order and precision, that He's also thinking about my well-being. Enough so that He would put some guardrails up so that if I pay attention to them, I get warned about things that would otherwise cause me harm. Now, if you were to say, all right, what is it that could be used to talk about, to tell me that God is great? You probably think, well, maybe just a wonderful testimony, a great speaker, maybe some well-done video, somehow, some way, that would communicate the message. But in this song, in this anthem, David says that space itself tells me that God is great. And this one that is so great, is so much bigger and greater than anyone and anything, I matter enough to Him that He put some guardrails up so that I can experience happiness and avoid misery and woe. You know, at the outset, we started with this question. How do I know that God is great? And maybe even if you saw that on the screen, or if you're watching online and you saw it on the bottom of your monitor or your TV screen, you thought, well, that's kind of this is going to be a yawner. How do I know that God is great? Big deal. After all, we learned that as a kid. God is great. God is good. Let us thank Him for our food. Why in the earth, why in the world does that matter? I'll tell you why it matters. It's because He's great in the end. That should be why you're here today. Because you are here to say, He's better than me. He's greater than me. Greater than anyone and anything that exists. Understanding this is the very foundation of worship. And unless and until we get that, what we're effectively doing is just kind of spinning our wheels. And understanding that He is not just great, but that He's also good, it inspires my worship and leads me to pursue Him. Now, at the outset, we talked about how it was that from Judy's recommendation, that really stands out in my mind because that message came from an unlikely source. It's like it gave it more weight because I wouldn't have expected that. Here we have unlikely sources, rules and space telling me how great, how good God is. The message is being communicated. The question is, are you listening? Will you bow your heads with me?